So, good morning, I'm Kristen Forster, and this is my almost daily blog, walks with my dogs, crumbs under the table. So it's good to be with you this morning. I'm just going to turn the camera around just a second. It's funny, I think most of my blogs start the same way. So last time I was doing these, it was 2 days ago, so yesterday was one of those mornings where there was a lot going on, so I was out quickly with the dogs and didn't get a chance to say hi. But what I was saying last time, a couple of days ago I think it was, we were looking at the issue of kind of the way in which Jesus' life, kind of his commission from the Lord, from everything he's doing, kind of all that really show who we are, who understands our days, as the Psalms touching on that we in a rather narrow way think, oh, that just means the number. It doesn't. It tells us he understands the days we're living in, who we are. He's numbered those things, he's laid them out in order, which is why, of course, we then read in the New Testament he prepares works for us. It's in that kind of context, mixing who we are with the world we're in, with the commission that is a gift to us, not as a burden, but to make sense, to give us an identity, and so on. So anyway, I said there are loads of people you can actually kind of trace this story with. I was just thinking as I was walking down to where we kind of let the dogs off the lead, what should we do this morning? I thought about Peter. Peter's story is so complicated, it's so fascinating, and partly I suppose it's because we get a lot about his story in the New Testament. With the name change, we know all about his background, family business, both from the records of both from the Bible and from the records of the early church and from archaeology, because his house has been excavated. So there's a huge amount that we can actually see, where you see the kind of grace of God commissioning him with what, in one sense, would be a huge burden if it wasn't that he was ideally suited for the role Jesus gives him. We could do the same with Matthew, so on. But what I thought I'd do this morning was Paul, who also kind of gives us a lot of clues in his letters. And I think Paul is really fascinating, obviously, because in many ways, he's the fundamentalist of his day in a quite violent and aggressive way, persecuting the church. For some of them are dying in prison as a result of his persecution. He's there. He's kind of complicit in Stephen's stoning. The book of Acts doesn't hide that from us. He's just a young man, which probably means he's about 16 at the time. And then he has, of course, his road to Damascus experience. And he tells that story 3 times in the book of Acts. And the third time he gives us a bit more detail, so we'll come back to that. Because what we do know about Paul's background, so we know he's from a well thought of and reasonably wealthy family, Paul of Tarsus. So but he's spent a lot of time coming down to Jerusalem to study under Gamaliel, who is kind of the leading Pharisaic scholar of his day. It's kind of in the previous generation, the famous one was Hillel, and Shammai, I think it was, another one before that. Gamaliel is the man of his generation. And so in that sense, it's kind of like, from a Jewish point of view, Paul's education is like going to Eton. It's really top class, and it has benefits. It's very easy. We kind of say, oh well, public schools, that doesn't mean you're any smarter, you just get better teaching. It's true, but Paul has an interesting combination, because even those who are atheists sometimes refer to him as being one of the great minds of that period of time. They rank him alongside although they're a bit early, of course, the Socrates and the Pliny. Certainly Pliny is kind of concurrent with Paul. But some of those kind of great orators, thinkers, because of the way he writes and the kind of complexity of what he is kind of threading together in his theology and so on. So you have a really smart mind with a really smart education. And he's someone who has embraced his Jewish identity to such a degree. And he really wants, I can put it this way, he wants intimacy with God. He wants to know the Lord. And I think, in that, of course, that is being frustrated for him when he tries to do it by law, because we don't achieve intimacy by law. But anyway, that becomes, I think, part, therefore, of understanding why Saul becomes a persecutor. Saul who becomes Paul. He probably doesn't actually become Paul. It's just an interesting little bit. It's not a name change. It's not like when God gets Abraham and says, I'll call you Abraham. Or when Jesus gets Simon and says, I'll call you Peter. Because we know from Paul's letters that he's a Roman citizen. It's likely that it's kind of about the grandparents' generation or so. There's a famous battle which the Jewish contingent actually helped Rome. I'm just trying to remember what the situation was. See, this is the thing. If I was at home, I could check these things out. I've got all my notes, but I can't do it right now off the top of my head. And as a result, there were a large number of Jews who became Roman citizens. Which is probably also, there's some wealth and land probably tied up with that, which is probably why it's referred to as Tarsus. So it's probably land in Tarsus. And as a result, most Jews following the kind of conventions ended up with three names. They had a Jewish name, and they had an everyday kind of Roman name, and they often had the name of their sponsor. So it's likely that Saul, who we know as Paul, well, he takes the name Paul as a Latin name, just meaning small. Partly maybe it describes him, maybe it's a kind of a sort of humility thing, I don't know. But probably, which we mustn't forget, is it's probably just because it rhymes with Saul. And if anyone who's we don't often spot it as kind of, if you're an English speaker, as your first language, but hugely often when you get people from cultures which speak languages very different from English, they will often choose in English a name that sounds a bit like their own name. It just makes it easier. And very often they will choose a name that means the same, or they will just choose a random one because they like it. So I've known all of those things over the years, known people who have done that, and it seems that Saul, his family have just done the same thing, which is we call him Saul, and we often think, why on earth would anyone call their son Saul? Surely they'd want to call him David because he's a much more famous king. It's interesting, if you look though at the rabbinic tradition about Saul, he is a kind of tragic figure, but a great figure. He is actually seen as being, if you like, better equipped for kingship than David. And it's the grace of God that makes David the man he is, which as Christians we all think, yeah, hey. But actually you understand that, so there was a kind of a sense in which it was unfortunate. So the ideal king would be Saul, who learnt some humility. So Saul is much more of a kind of a Jewish hero than we might have realised, even though he comes to a bad end. So they've called their son Saul. They've probably chosen Paul because it sounds the same, and maybe makes a statement maybe he is physically stature, maybe he is short. And then they've educated him, and Paul doesn't ever give us his sponsor's name because probably it's a Roman general or whatever, and maybe one of those things that he just doesn't think is appropriate for the church, who are perhaps being persecuted by the Romans. But then he's got sent off down to Jerusalem. His family, it seems to be down in Judea as well, and he studies under Gamaliel. And Gamaliel taught all of his students that they had to have a vocation in life that was not just service of the word, service of scripture, and if you like, in our traditional sense, that church kind of ministry sense, which I think is really interesting, because how often have I heard we use the word tent making, which of course is Paul's profession, and we turn it into something that we turn tent making into a kind of a euphemism for a job that you have to do in a country where you're not allowed to be a full-time minister. And so it kind of becomes almost it's kind of, oh, well, I have to do this, I have to do this job because that's what allows me to be here. Which isn't the case for Paul. Paul actually sees it fundamentally as part of his spirituality and part of his worship. And that's the way, we're assuming that he takes it in the kind of way that Gamaliel probably gave it to him. So let's turn the camera around. And so actually, being a tent maker is not just a kind of an easy convenience. You hear Paul regularly talks about it. Well, I say regularly, at least once. He talks about it as being of benefit. You know, he says, I didn't have to take anything from you. I paid my own way, because he's able to kind of work. And you know, I understand, because Paul also talks about workers being worthy of their wages, and we have a situation from the early church which is very similar to today. There's a whole combination of the work you do in a kind of secular sense, and then the things that you're doing that are purely within the church, and how does the church release that, and is it able to kind of to produce something? Is it able to kind of help fund that, and so on? So all those things are real, and I'm not being critical of any kind of those solutions. But what I want to get across is how important it is, which I think is true, is that we have a profession, in the sense of we have developed a skill that is useful for humanity, not just the church. And ironically, because I've spent time 100% in church, and at times I'm kind of 50-50. I look at my pastoring skills, and I recognise that they work whether you're in the church and a believer or not. And so I found ways of kind of turning that experience into something that is valuable. But interestingly, for Paul, of course, it gives him context. It gives him a contact. It kind of works him into the way the world works. It allows you to be salt in a way that you can't be if you're kind of isolated in a job where you only ever see those who are members of the church. And hear me, I really don't want to sound critical, because I've been there. So I'm just trying to get across the benefits that Paul I think sees in his calling. And then you think about what actually happens. So it's Paul. It's interesting. I said Paul tells the story of how he gets saved on the road to Damascus. And it's sometimes I've heard it kind of said, that Paul didn't have any choice in the matter. I think he did. I mean, he obviously gets hit by quite an experience, but my understanding is God does what is the desires of our heart. He works with those things. And that's always useful to know, because, as I said, in many ways, Paul becomes, if you like, the fundamentalist terrorist of his day to the church. And to understand some of that, you understand someone who has deeply wound his identity for the wrong reasons into his Jewish faith, but somewhere inside him, I think, there was a genuine hunger for the experience of God. And so what winds him up so much is he's doing all the right religious things, but these stupid Christians who are living by grace were a bunch of failures from a religious point of view, and yet here they are with an experience and enjoying it and telling it as testimony that he just doesn't get. And so within that, I think I suspect that there's something in Paul, and he writes about it in Romans 10, that it's not for us to judge, but I think he's driving at the same thing. You don't always know. The person who seems to be the most anti may have that question going on, buried deep under layers of pride and other things, that just allow the Lord and give him permission, if you like, to step in, which is what I think he does with Paul. So anyway, he gets knocked off the horse, and he sees the light, and he hears Jesus. And the third time he tells us, he says that that Jesus told him that he would be a minister to the church, a servant of the church, in other words. The very church that he's been persecuting, now he's going to become a servant of it. And he would be a witness, which means that he would write stuff down, he'd have testimony to it, of things that Jesus would show him. And actually that is, of course, the shape of Paul's ministry as time goes on. He does become a witness. He actually kind of explicitly kind of pairs those things in Galatians 1, where he talks about, I've been a servant of the church, and then he talks about the great mystery that he's now revealing in the days of the Gentiles, because we all remember, of course, that's Paul's great calling, was to be the first apostle to the Gentiles, which is the mystery of Christ in you. And I won't explain how all of that fits together, but just highlighting it's all there. So what he's saying is, I've been a minister to the church, but I've also been a witness to truths that Jesus has revealed to me. And Paul talks about his experiences, his spiritual experiences, where Jesus is showing him something. But what Jesus is able to show Paul he's able to do in very subtle ways, if I can put it that way. And that often is the way I think God works. You know, we all hunger for this, if you like, the miraculous divine angel encounter. And I have one friend who I really can say I do know that their story was true. That sounds terrible that I disbelieve other people. But I think often what we do is we have something and an experience and we put something on it. And it is the Lord speaking to us, but it becomes kind of bigger in our telling. But so I know that people do have those experiences, but very often the way the Lord speaks to us is by little nudges and nuances and short words. And it's not that we're not seeing him in our prayers and our visions, we do, but in those things he often says things in shorthand, this is my experience anyway, which make sense to me and actually open up a whole host of things in me that were, if you like, planted as seeds to be uncovered by this small bit of revelation. And so what that means in Paul's sense is, you see, he's a Pharisee, and he's studied under Gamaliel, and therefore he's had access to literature that others haven't had. He's had access to the rabbinic thinkings about the Messiah, and he's seen things in there. He's seen discussions about the 4 different Messiahs. The Messiah ben Joseph, who represents the northern tribes and comes out of Galilee. He's seen his Messiah ben David, who comes from south, but unifies the two. He kind of draws the two nations together. The Messiah the Messiah, the son of Aaron, the priestly Messiah, and the prophet, which is a figure that we get referenced in he's read all of that literature, which is all there. We're beginning to uncover it and discover it and get it translated, so you're getting more of it. But Paul, unlike someone like Peter or any of the others of Jesus' disciples, even someone educated like Matthew or John, who may not be the top level, but he can certainly write all right, those guys haven't had access to those layers and levels of training. But Paul has, and so actually within them he sees hints and he sees clues. And so you can imagine he's in that kind of prayer kind of context where he has an experience of the Lord, and the Lord just has to say a few things, because actually it comes with it a whole network of ideas, and the Spirit kind of guides Paul through those things. And so Paul is so key in the developing of the early church kind of Christology. And it's often kind of argued, therefore, that's the reason why the Gospels have to be written after Paul, because Paul had to invent it all first as a great theologian. And then the Gospels got written because they seem to kind of back it up. But I don't think that's the case. I think what you can say more is that the Gospels have it sort of implicitly, whereas Paul puts it explicitly. And he kind of argues those scripture things. So you can see how all that layers of education work in giving Paul a part of his calling, which is to reveal the mysteries, to show, to be a witness of the things that Jesus will show him, because he has that background. But equally, he was called to be a minister. And Paul's big church story, of course he goes all over, is he establishes a base in Ephesus. And that's where he uses the practical skill of tent making, because actually tent making is kind of a euphemistic job title. It's a bit like in English we would refer to a saddler. And a saddler, of course, the big important things that they made with leather were saddles. That's why you need to be really skilled leather worker to make saddles. But actually it's a more kind of generic word. And in a similar way, tent making was a kind of, if you like, the pinnacle of leather working. Because actually good quality tents for mobile merchant communities travelling up and down the Silk Road and everything else, these were top quality pieces of technology. And so tent making was actually a very kind of skilled, broad industry, but it's actually an extension. It's kind of, at the heart of it is leather working, which is why I think when we read about Paul sending sweat handkerchiefs around, it's because that's actually, he's busy working during the day. He's getting sweaty, and people need prayer. It's not that he kind of has this wonderful idea and that this is the best way to do it. It's actually very pragmatic. He wants to send something to people so they really know he is praying for them. And so he sends the sweatbands that he kind of works with in the blazing hot sweat and blazing hot weather of the Ephesus tent making industry. Those things get sent off, and people are getting healed by them. And so, as I say, and it becomes something that now every few years a church might do, where we have a kind of sweatband ministry. Sorry, I've been around in church too long not to laugh at some of the things that kind of go on. But actually, it's actually, if you kind of give it its context, it was actually an expression of his work life. And in that kind of context, of course, Paul meets all sorts of other people in other industries which allow him to kind of exercise his church building kind of functions. And so he's able to make a base in Ephesus. And it helps, of course, that Priscilla and Aquila come and they have a similar industry. They set up a business together probably. So it allows him to actually establish his base, is why we use it for missionary kind of context. It means that it funds probably some of the missions work. And so what you're finding is, in many ways, well, not in many ways, that actually Paul's ministry before the Lord, Paul's commission by Jesus, makes perfect sense of his background and upbringing. And his citizenship allows him in the end to stand before Caesar and give testimony. Again, we don't read that in the book of Acts, because the book of Acts was probably prepared in preparation for Paul to stand before the emperor. So, of course, it doesn't cover him standing before the emperor. We understand that he gets released first time, but he gets arrested again a few years later and then executed. But he makes a successful plea and presents the gospel to the emperor. And he's uniquely positioned to do so by the things that have gone into his background, the things that have made him who he is. And again, it's really, I suppose, what I'm wanting to just draw out is that is the wonderful thing about the way the Lord works with us. He's not giving us hard things to do that make no sense of us. He gives us challenging things to do that make life interesting. I kind of do two things realistically now. No, actually, no, that's not true. Actually, but both things I know they make sense of who I am. And sometimes I can feel lazy because I think I'm only doing things that I'm good at. Because there are always elements where we have to go through stuff where we're doing stuff that aren't really us, but that's part of learning to mature and all of those sorts of things. But it's wonderful when we start to realise that the life that the Lord calls us to, the works he prepares beforehand, makes so much sense. The things that we enjoy doing, they keep us engaged in life. And to others they could be impossible to do. But to us they're not easy, but they're exciting. And that's the wonderful thing. I often say, if you're not finding a sense of connection with the Lord in the work you do, then we need to ask questions about what it is we're doing, or we need to change our attitude. One of those two things. And I would say that today. So, you know, if you're watching this, is if life doesn't feel, if it feels frustrating, not because something that's pushing you forward, but just something that seems to be holding you back, ask those questions. Do I need to change my attitude? Is there something in my psyche that's a boulder that's stopping me getting the release here? Or is it, in actual fact, I'm just doing something because I'm trying to get value from it, because I see other people do. It's not really who I am. Because I really do believe that's the way the Lord works with people. That's why I see it in so many people. We'll do some more as the days go by. But this morning, just as we kind of finish off, just want to kind of pray that prayer, that Father, you would, you love each one of us, and having it easy doesn't mean that we're in your will, because Paul gets beaten up, and he gets in shipwrecks, and he has to do all sorts of uncomfortable things. But life felt good, I'm sure, because Paul knew he was doing what in many ways he'd been equipped to do, and not just equipped, but he had instincts for, and it made sense of who he was. And so Jesus, at every kind of level, not just at a spiritual level, but at every level, Paul could say, I've lived a full life. I've lived a life that felt worthwhile living. I don't mean that in a trivial sense, because every one of us has a life that's worthwhile living. But sometimes we need the courage to step out of where we are and into where we need to be. Not because it's something really, really dangerous, but actually just it's that human level. So Jesus, just ask that you would give us the courage to do that, to know more of the flow, Doesn't mean we won't know contention, doesn't mean we don't know difficult things, but we do know we're in the right place. In Jesus' name. Amen. So I will probably see you tomorrow. See you tomorrow, which will be good. But until then, I'm going to say goodbye. So yeah, I'm off.